Ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Anatomy of a CIA, a governance perspective conference call. My name is Chris, and I will be your conference moderator for today. At this time, all participants are in listen-only mode. Later, we will conduct a question-and-answer session. If at any time during the call you require operator assistance, please press star followed by zero, and then I will be happy to assist you. And I would now like to turn the conference over to your host for today, Ms. Michelle Cooper, Senior Vice President and Corporate Responsibility Officer for Catholic Health Initiatives. Ma'am, you may proceed.
Well, buddy, we're happy to do, I think, our fifth webcast for our Audit and Compliance Committee, Finance Audit and Compliance Committee, and board members. And this one, we're going to focus on a real-life case scenario from our Kentucky market, where just in the last year we signed a corporate integrity agreement. I'm hoping this webcast will provide some insights as to what board members can do to help an organization continue to foster the development of their corporate responsibility program, mitigate exposure to getting a corporate integrity agreement from the government, and also just talk about how to enhance overall effectiveness operations as we continue on as a system. Before that, I'd like to offer a reflection, and given that it's Thanksgiving week next week, I thought I'd start with a poem that's entitled Be Thankful. Be thankful that you don't already have everything you desire. If you did, what would there be to look forward to? Be thankful when you don't know something, for it gives you the opportunity to learn. Be thankful for the difficult times during times you grow. Be thankful for your limitations because they give you opportunities for improvement. Be thankful for each new challenge because it will build your strength and character. Be thankful for your mistakes. They will teach you valuable lessons. Be thankful when you're tired and weary because it means you've made a difference. Be thankful for the good things. A life of rich fulfillment comes to those who are thankful for the setbacks. And with that, the following prayer. Loving God, bless us with patience to allow the unfolding of things in our own time, the wisdom to act in the best interest of the healing ministry for those whom we serve, with openness to our own inner spirit and others on this call, with to share our thoughts and insights with others, and with confidence in ourselves in your grace. We ask the same. Amen. Okay, well, I didn't get started, and we can move to the next slide. Objectives of the call today are to increase the general knowledge of corporate integrity agreements, why they were put in place, what they encompass, and how a board can get involved in understanding the setbacks that can be caused from corporate integrity agreements. To aid our knowledge of an actual case scenario, and again, that's at St. Joseph's in London in Kentucky, and our understanding of some of the risk mitigation efforts that CAI has put in place to help prevent future CIAs, and then again to highlight key considerations from a fiduciary perspective. So let's start with what is a CIA? What is a corporate integrity agreement? Corporate integrity agreement is really a negotiation between the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Office of Inspector General, or the OIG as we refer to them, and healthcare providers as part of a settlement agreement. Typically, there are allegations arising from civil false claims statutes. Security agreements were enacted to ensure that providers are responding and addressing to significant concerns that have been identified. Healthcare provider consents to rigorous standards set forth in formal agreement that both the OIG and the provider sign. The OIG agrees not to exclude that healthcare provider from being able to participate in federally funded programs, Medicare, Medicaid, and other programs. So very rigorous, descriptive document that details certain procedures, and we're going to spend some time talking about those. What is involved in a corporate integrity agreement? They have very common elements. When you look at one compared to another, you typically see some very common things. CAs are required, or CA requirements are often tailored, though, to specific issues. So if an organization is getting in trouble for a relationship that they had with a physician, we just power. So I'm going to switch to, luckily I printed out a copy of PowerPoint. So Betsy, I just have to have you move through the slides. As
okay, that's fine.
Going in and out. But CI requirements vary based on the severity of the issues that were identified in the investigation by the Office of Inspector General. But typical CIA requirements generally center around hiring a compliance officer, making sure that you've got a compliance committee, developing formal written standards and policies and procedures around what particular things need to be in place to prevent fraud and abuse, implement comprehensive employee physician board and contractor training program, retain independent organizations to conduct annual reviews. So, for example, if an organization gets in trouble for a quality care issue or medical necessity issue, an organization might be required to hire an independent review organization that would come in and periodically review particular charts associated with that area. Also have to establish a confidential disclosure program, such as a hotline or a web-based tool where employees and others can go and report concerns. They also can restrict employment of eligible persons, and actually that already is a requirement. They have very strict standards for what they expect you do as an organization to make sure that you do not hire people that have been excluded from participating in Medicare, other federal programs. Generally, CIAs require an organization to report any overpayments or reportable events, also ongoing investigations and legal proceedings. So in the course of ongoing work, the organization, if they identify a subsequent issue, even if it's not related to the specifics of a corporate integrity agreement, give an example, say an organization identified a concern around their coding practices, they have to notify government of that subsequent issue within a specific time frame. They also require the organization to provide an implementation report, typically within 60 to 90 days, and then annual reports through the term of the corporate integrity agreement. Corporate integrity agreements typically last 5 years. We've had 3 corporate integrity agreements at CHI in the that I've been here, and each one of those have been 5 years. So move on to the next slide. Corporate integrity agreement requirements you may see, depending on the particular corporate integrity agreement, is sometimes there is a board compliance expert that is required to send a board, and the board could be required to complete certifications attesting to specific requirements of the CIA and also the effectiveness of the compliance program. There can also be a requirement for management accountability and certification similar to what is asked of the board. Also can require that you have additional deputy compliance officers, integrity champions throughout the organization, depending on depth and breadth of the issues identified. Corporate integrity agreements typically require some form of a risk assessment process around compliance issues and also a mitigation process. So as compliance risks or issues are identified, they expect those to be mitigated or resolved. There can also be a component around financial recoupment program. We've seen this more recently in a couple of recent settlement agreements involving pharmaceutical industries, where the executives may be required to pay back their executive incentive compensation if they do not meet the terms of the corporate integrity agreement. Transparency program, so making sure that any payments to physicians are properly computed, calculated, and monitored. They also require extensive training, and some corporate integrity agreements have included a component where a board has been required to complete anywhere from 20 to 40 hours of additional education a year, depending on the severity of the breaches. Some of the pharmaceutical industries have had the pharmaceuticals have very stringent corporate integrity agreements because of the nature of some of their matters. And in fact, some of the settlements have been in the range of $1 billion for the pharmaceutical industry, typically around their marketing practices and off-label marketing specifically, as well as some of their use of pharmaceuticals. There'll be a requirement for adverse research event data reporting to the FDA, and also registration of clinical studies, if an organization is getting in trouble related to research. Care corporate integrity agreement. CHI, there have only been 10 active agreements thus far that were specified as a quality of care corporate integrity agreement. One of those agreements was actually a CHI corporate integrity agreement related to St. Joseph Medical Center in Maryland. CHI has sold that entity, so we no longer have that entity, and really we only owned that entity for the first year of their corporate integrity agreement. But that one involved False Claims Act settlement to resolve allegations of fraud that impacted the quality of patient care. And it requires a provider to retain an independent quality monitor. And one of the things that you'll note when we go through the London Corporate Integrity Agreement requirements, even though the London agreement that we're going to spend some time on doesn't specifically call out that it's a quality of care corporate integrity agreement, when you look at it, it's actually more stringent on the quality side than the actual agreement we had in Towson, Maryland. So it's very interesting that government did not call out the London settlement to be a quality care corporate integrity agreement. Next. Take some time now and really decipher what it's like to go through an investigation with the government. We're going to give you the facts and circumstances around our most recent settlement with the government in London, Kentucky. I can tell you that the corporate integrity agreements that we've had with CH have all involved physician relations. In all three situations, the physicians involved have been in some form reprimanded for their activities. The difference with the agreement that we have in London, Kentucky is these were actually employed physicians, whereas our previous two agreements were with providers but non-employed providers. So I'll turn it over to Betsy. This slide here that you're looking at just depicts some of the news that comes when you settle with government, and that really highlights how much press starts when you get in trouble with the government. And one of the things that CHI is very committed to, and I know all of you know on this call, is doing the right thing. So when you have a physician and get into trouble, an investigation that involves something we did wrong, take those experiences, we look at them, we decipher them, and we figure out how do we prevent and mitigate our exposure going forward. And one of the things that Betsy is going to point out as she goes through this presentation is one of the reasons that CHI was able to settle pretty favorably with the government on this investigation is this involved us self-disclosing this issue to the government. She'll explain that some facts and circumstances increased the risk around this related to some whistleblowers that joined later on in the process. But I'm going to turn it over now to Betsy and let her walk through this.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. I'm Betsy Wade. I'm the Vice President for Corporate Responsibility for Kentucky One Health, and St. Joseph London is part of Kentucky One Health. Michelle mentioned the settlement that CHI had with St. Joseph Towson After that investigation, CHI decided to look at stent cases nationwide and did an internal review to see if there were any outliers that would fall out. And as a result of that, they did find some outliers at St. Joseph London within that employed physician practice. About 5 providers in that practice, and one particular provider, Dr. Patel, fell out more than some of the others. So as a result of that, we did send a number of records to review to a third party, and identified that some of those cases perhaps were done and were not medically necessary. As a result, Dr. Patel is terminated from his position at St. Joseph London, and we did make a self-disclosure to the government. We're paying about $250,000 in that matter. And as soon as that settlement was completed, it was just a few weeks later that we learned that there was a whistleblower in the case. It was actually 3 whistleblowers that were physicians at Central Baptist Hospital in Lexington, Kentucky, which is about an hour and a half of London. What we believe happened is that several patients that had been to the practice at London went to Lexington for a second opinion or to see a physician there, and as a result, those doctors started gathering facts and became whistleblowers. The government did join that investigation, and then that set us on the road to this corporate integrity agreement, as well as the settlement that we had with the Department of Justice. And I'll mention right now, ahead a little bit, that Dr. Patel, he did end up having criminal charges pressed against him, and he is now serving time in a federal prison. 2 of the other physicians that worked with him just recently entered into their own corporate integrity agreements about 2 weeks ago, and also both settled for about $350,000 each. And one additional physician that is still under criminal investigation. The physicians were terminated from St. Joseph London. That was our settlement at London. We entered into a settlement agreement with the U.S. Department of Justice for $16.5 million on January 22nd of this year, and also paid about $300,000 in relators fees for the attorneys that represented the whistleblowers. Our agreement with the Department of Justice basically resolved all of the potential civil claims that or could have been brought by the federal government or the state that's out of the past relationship that we had with those cardiologists. And as mentioned, they are no longer practicing at the hospital. To the settlement agreement that we had with the Department of Justice, we also entered into the corporate integrity agreement with the Office of Inspector General, and it was on the same day. And CIA is for a 5-year term, and does detail all of the covered entities or the covered persons under that agreement. And one of the things that they did point out is that the board members or directors are covered under this agreement. And so this presentation is going to focus quite on the fiduciary responsibility for the board itself. So the CIA obligations, as Michelle mentioned, this agreement is much more comprehensive than the agreement that CI had at St. Joseph Towson. There's a lot of focus on the standard compliance program elements, but there's a great deal more focus on quality, peer review, cardiac procedures and cardiac surgeries, and also focused arrangements, or a slower way to say that would be contracting and unallowable costs for our cost report. We have a great deal of compliance education that I'll talk about in a few minutes. Then there's board and management accountability as well. We had put all of these elements in place within a 60 to 90-day time frame from the effective date of the CA. It all resulted in additional expense to the organization so that we could comply with the requirements of the 5-year agreement. And we'll go over some of the details of the costs closer to the end of the presentation. So management and oversight that we were required to have, one of the individuals we had to put in place at London was a full-time compliance officer. Corporate responsibility was actually managed centrally across the state. We had a fairly large staff that was managing compliance matters at St. Joseph London, but the CIA required that we actually have someone on site day to day. We hired a CRO named Heather Lovelace, who came with a lot of experience. She works for the senior management there at London. She reports directly to the CEO, and she does make periodic reports to our board, which is the Kentucky One Board. The compliance committee that was separate from the committee at Kentucky One Health. So a compliance committee specifically for St. Joseph London. Heather chairs that, and we had to include a board member on that committee, and that was a new requirement in the CIA that we had not seen in previous CIAs. The chair of our audit and compliance committee did it on our compliance committee at St. Joseph London. And then they required that there be a board review and oversight of the compliance program and the CIA requirements themselves. The board meet quarterly. We actually meet more close to monthly, definitely every 2 months. And we have to report any changes in the composition of the board within 15 days to the IG. Just as an example, we just had two new board members appointed to the Kentucky One Health Board, so we have to report that to our monitor. Annually, this is also something new, the board has to adopt a resolution that has to be signed by each member, and it summarizes their review and oversight of the CIA and all the requirements that are within it. So eventually we'll say, the Board of Directors has made a reasonable inquiry into the operations of St. Joseph London's compliance program, including the performance of the compliance officer and the compliance committee. And based on inquiry and review, the board has concluded, to the best of its knowledge, St. Joseph London has implemented an effective compliance program to meet the federal health care program requirements and the obligations of the CIA. So that is a fiduciary responsibility of the board, like I said, has not been present in other CIAs across the country. Management and oversight, the CIA also required that St. Joseph London have a full-time physician executive, and they did not when the CIA went into effect. You said we could have as many as 3 physicians fill that one full-time role. We appointed 2 half-time physician executives. One focuses on quality and one focuses on medical staff matters. Those also are members of senior management, and they do provide quarterly quality reports to the board. We hire a full-time medical director for the cardiac cath lab, and that person had to be board certified. And being in a rural area, London, Kentucky is in eastern Kentucky, it was very difficult to find a board certified physician. We did have to do that, and that person does provide oversight to the cath lab, and then provides reports to the compliance officer as well as to the board quality committee. Implement standards and procedures, standards of conduct already that was implemented as part of CHI's corporate responsibility program. We have to have all covered persons sign a new attestation for standards of conduct, and then as new individuals are hired at St. Joseph London, they're required to read the standard of conduct and sign it within 30 days. We do it with the medical staff. We had to implement a number of policies and procedures. Again, they were focused more on quality and peer review, credential privileging, and the actual procedures themselves, more so than your typical compliance policies and procedures that you've seen in other corporate integrity agreements. There were a few policies, such as one on anti-kickback and STARK, we did have in place, but the bulk of the policies really focused on quality. As Michelle mentioned, can be quite extensive, and the corporate integrity agreement for London requires that we have 2 hours of general training. It essentially covers the requirements of the CIA. The principles of the compliance program and it over our standards of conduct. We also have to provide 3 hours of specific training on the policies and procedures that I just mentioned, 3 hours of training on contracting, specific to physician contracting with the hospital, 4 hours of board member training, and the board training is broken down into the 2 hours of general training that I just mentioned above, and 2 hours of training that focuses on board and corporate governance. All board members have to receive their training within 30 days of becoming a board member. They had to train the entire board and all committee members within 90 days of the effective date of the CIA. Each board member had to sign an attestation stating that they had completed the education. We keep all that documentation on file and it's submitted to the Office of Inspector General as part of our reporting that's required. There was an initial report that was required post-implementation, and then another report, Michelle mentioned earlier as well, that we do every year. And so each annual report going forward will contain a summary of all the training that has been completed by covered persons under the agreement. It's also required that we have independent oversight and monitoring. These are typically called independent review organizations, or IROs. St. Joseph London CIA required that we have a peer review consultant and several independent review organizations in place. And several of our board members have been interviewed by these external parties. Now, fortunately, because of the experience that CHI had at St. Joseph Towson, we were able to use some of the same consultants and independent review organizations for St. Joseph London. And we also were actually assigned the same monitor with the Office of Inspector General. So because we had familiarity with those individuals, it's made the process much easier at St. Joseph London. Consultant, his name is Dr. Marty Kalish. He's an attorney as well as a physician, and he was brought in within 60 days of the effective date of the CIA. And he's really focused on peer review, critical and privileging, and discipline among the medical staff. He is there weekly on site at St. Joseph London and will be for the duration of the 5 years of the CIA. He's reporting his findings and making recommendations not only to the facility but also to the OIG. And his actual report will also be reviewed by the Kentucky One Health Board. He also is responsible for assisting in the implementation of recommendations. So he's not just there as a consultant providing recommendations and advice, but he is actually there to help make sure that those recommendations are actually implemented and then testing them to make sure that they work. And one of the main areas of focus, again, is monitoring the peer review process for the medical staff. We were required to have 4 independent review organizations. One of those, however, we are allowed to suspend because St. Joseph London, after it went into effect, evaluated its clinical programs, decided that cardiac surgeries would be suspended indefinitely. And as a result of that, the OIG allowed us to suspend the requirement to have the cardiac surgery IRO. Currently have 3 IROs on site for cardiac procedures, one for the contracting, and one for the allowable costs. And I'll go over those in a little bit more detail. Cardiac procedures, the IRO again is engaged for the full 5-year term within 3 months of the effective date, and focused on medical necessity and the appropriateness of any of the interventional cardiac procedures that are being done. The guidelines for this are established by the American College of Cardiology. So ultimately, they're evaluating the medical necessity of any interventional cardiac procedures. And again, just like Marty, we'll be filing an annual report with the federal government, and they'll be making recommendations to the facility, and that report also will be reviewed by the board. So the IRO will be sampling 50 interventional cardiac procedures And they'll be looking at the quality of the procedure, they'll be looking at the post-op outcomes, and they'll be looking at the appropriateness of the procedure management. So as I mentioned, that requirement was suspended, so I won't go through that in detail, but if we were to implement that again, it would be for 5 years, and they would be focused on medical necessity for cardiac surgeries. So is Hall Render, and they're here for 5 years as well. Hall Render is a law firm based out of Indianapolis, Indiana, and basically making sure that St. Joseph London is meeting the requirements of Stark and anti-kickback, that we are following the CHI policies and procedures for physician transactions, or legal policies 9 and 10. Actually, they've come in and they've done a pre-assessment. I've looked at our systems, our processes, and our policies, and they've made minimal recommendations. But they're looking at the entire contracting process from initiation through the review and approval, the tracking of arrangements. We use software called MetaTrack to track all of our contracts, and actually look at the payments that are made as a result of those contracts to make sure that the payments were made appropriately. We're also monitoring the use of leased space, for example. They will actually go out and do walkthroughs of space that we lease to physicians to make sure that physicians aren't taking over more space than is specified in the contract, for example. That the space is actually what is specified in the contract itself. They also compliance officers quarterly review and reporting to the compliance committee on the focused arrangements, the approval process, and policies and procedures. And as I mentioned before, they've done a review of our systems and our processes and made some minimal recommendations, and those have been implemented. And then they also were quantifying and repaying any overpayments when appropriate. For the year, Hall Render will actually select 50 contracts and will conduct a review to make sure that St. Joseph London has complied with all the requirements of our policies and procedures, that contract itself is logged and loaded into MetaTrack, gone through the appropriate internal review and approval process, and again, that the payments were made in accordance with the contract itself. The IRO that we have at St. Joseph London is focused on allowable costs, and this is being handled by Ernst & Young. And EY will review the cost reports for St. Joseph London, again, for the duration of the 5-year term. They are making sure that we are not including any unallowable costs on the cost report. And so allowable costs might include things like any time that I may spend on matters related to St. Joseph London and the CIA. I have to document that, and I turn in timesheets on basis to Heather, who's the CRO for London, and we turn that over to the finance department so they can build the cost report. Also making sure that all the legal costs that were associated with the CIA and any review costs for third-party auditors, pulling of medical records and doing those reviews, that those are also captured on the cost report as well. Then the IROs and the peer review consultant were required to have their other arrangement requirements. For example, in all of our contracts, we have to make sure that each party receives a copy of our standard conduct and our Stark and anti-kickback policies, and then we include statements in our contracts that either party will violate the Stark law or the anti-kickback statute. We also have a toll-free hotline in place, which we did, We re-advertised that and re-educated everyone on the use of the hotline. And 9 is one of the elements that's required under the federal sentencing guidelines for an active compliance program. We have to make sure that within 30 days of discovery that we notify our OIG monitor of investigation or legal proceeding that involves any allegations that the facility or any individuals that work there have committed a crime or engaged in any fraud. And then in 60 days, we have to notify the OIG of any overpayments that we've identified. And we did that already because that was already part of the regulations, part of our practice.
And we might just mention, too, that CHI's several of the basic requirements of the Corporate Integrity Agreement, including the hotline, CHI has had in place for years.
Yes, absolutely. Also, several items that are considered reportable events. If any of these occur, we have to report it to the OIG within 30 days. Those include things such as a substantial overpayment, and you might say, well, what's substantial? It was not defined in the agreement. So that's where we have to use judgment, or we have to work with our monitor from the OIG to determine whether it's considered substantial and whether it would require a 30-day notification. If there's a violation of the law, or if we employ or contract with an ineligible person, we notify them within 30 days. We had a quality violation that resulted in the death of a patient or any danger to the health or safety or well-being of a patient or a beneficiary, we would have to notify the OIG. And then finally, if the facility were to file bankruptcy, we have to notify OIG within 30 days. And the next one is interesting. This was not something that was in other corporate agreements, but any changes to a business unit to notify the OIG within 30 days. So that could be if we sell a business unit, if we closed a business unit, or if we purchased a business unit that's associated with St. Joseph London, we have to notify OIG. And they need to know that so they can change the scope of their review, or broaden it or lessen it based on the entities that we have. Earlier, there are multiple reports that we're required to produce for the OIG that are associated with the CIA. The first one was the implementation report that was due to the OIG within 120 days of the effective date. There were a couple questions, which is, primary for them to have. We answered those, and we did get a certification letter back from the OIG accepting our report. So our next report is not due until March 22nd of 2015, and then we'll have a report due per year, March 22nd through the year 2019. The annual report really summarizes the entire year's work of every requirement under the CIA. And the implementation report itself was about the size of a 16-ounce water bottle. So if you can imagine what a 16-ounce water bottle looks like, that's how tall the report was when it was printed out. The annual report, we have been told, can end up being about 5 times that amount. So already working on the annual report, compile the documentation of everything that we've done, and we'll have that turned in by the March 22nd deadline.
Great. So before we move on to talking about some of the responsibilities associated with being a board member in preventing, monitoring, and being involved in investigations, we wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about how much it costs to get corporate integrity agreement, and also talk about CHI's position on why we self-disclose what we find, and everybody's comfortable with the reasoning around that, not only from a mission perspective, but just from a cost reduction standpoint. So when we look at the cost of the investigation at London, the seller initial payment was $257, which Betsy mentioned. That was when we went forward a couple weeks before the whistleblowers joined the case. When we hired the outside physician expert to conduct a review, that cost about $180,000. Since this investigation began, which was several years ago from the time that were the investigation till the time we actually signed with the government, we paid over, and actually this number's a little bit higher, probably closer to $800,000 now in outside legal fees. Not to mention all of the local Kentucky One and national staff and leadership time that have been involved in developing additional processes, reviews that needed to take place, implementing new standards. And we'll also talk about just some of the leadership turnover and the costs associated with that in a minute. I'm going to let Betsy speak to that. But also the financial, reputational, relationship harm. Once you have these come out in the press, there is an impact to operations. And the best example of that is our facility, St. Joseph in Towson, Maryland. When we had that particular matter, we basically could not sustain keeping that hospital, which is one of the reasons why we chose to sell that to the University of Maryland. The harm that was done just for press and the change in operations was devastating to those operations. So that's probably the biggest cost you'll see in getting a corporate integrity agreement. London's done a great job to recover and has been processes and is working diligently on repairing some of that reputational harm, but again, it takes years to recover from that. We're also involved in several civil litigation claims with the respective patients that were involved in this matter, and our risk department is working diligently with the legal team on those. And we don't have the cost yet of what that will involve, but we know that that will be additional cost to the organization. Betsy, take a minute and just talk about some of the leadership turnover that occurred as a result of this.
I just have a bit of breaking news, though, on the litigation. Yesterday, the jury returned the first verdict on the first case and did find in favor of St. Joseph London. We did have a positive outcome in the first case.
That's wonderful.
Yes. So Joseph London, after the CIA went effect, we did have some significant turnover in leadership. As we're working through the negotiation process with the Department of Justice and with the IG, and we knew that we were headed toward a CIA, the CEO and the CNO for St. Joseph London back in the fall of 2013 were replaced with a new CEO and CNO. Then after the corporate integrity agreement went into place and we had the IROs and the consultants coming in, and unfortunately the CEO who was there did not have of experience that was needed and had no prior experience with the CIA. The result of that, the IROs became frustrated with the response from management, and recently a decision was made to management there, and so we now have an interim CEO and an interim CNO. The interim CEO actually served as the interim CEO at St. Joseph Towson, and he does have significant experience with the CIA, but that does bring additional cost and additional disruption to the staff. We also had to replace the director of quality for St. Joseph London. That person was deemed to be ineffective by the IROs who came in. Had quite a bit of management turnover there. The management now is being stabilized and things are turning around, but it does add to the cost of investigation. And I'm sorry, the cost of the investigation, but to the cost of the CIA as a whole. So I did talk about the investigation costs, and the post-settlement costs also are significant. We estimated that the CIA at London will result in about $3 million more additional cost annually, and that includes all of the oversight costs from the IROs and the peer review consultant, for example. That does not include things like lodging for this interim leadership team. And see detailed out here, the peer review consultant is about $1.2 million annually plus expenses. had the cardiac surgery IRO, we would have paid about the same for that. So that is a little bit of savings there. Arrangements IRO is about $100,000 annually plus expenses. This allowable cost IRO is an additional $100,000. To have full-time director of the cath lab is about $125,000, and we had to add another $125,000 to have another half-time chief medical officer. For the compliance officer with expenses is about $175,000, and the education and training, we are at least still estimating the cost for that, but it was $400,000 range.
It's really important to point out that we, with the way CHI is organized from a compliance standpoint, we would not put a full-time compliance officer in an organization that size. So, that's created a significant burden for the organization, and it also points to the fact of how important it is for us to prevent getting a corporate integrity agreement at the national level, because that could entail a vast number of additional resources in the compliance arena, which is why CHI has recently increased the resources in compliance in the last 3 years when we centralized compliance. The reason for that was to make sure that we had adequate coverage and put monitoring of activities across the continuum to mitigate that exposure. And I think one thing that would be really important to talk about, and maybe it's on the next slide, actually go one more slide ahead where we get into what is CHI doing. Can we move to that?
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah. I talked a little bit about the fact that 3 years ago, CHI centralized and standardized CRP across the organization. A good, solid reason, one of the reasons we did that was the experience that we had in St. Joe's House and the original stint matter with the government. They pointed out to us that although we had standard processes, standard policies, standard conduct for the organization, how those were rolled out varied because the compliance staff reported at the local market. 3 years ago, we made a decision to pull all that together, to standardize it. We've moved to a regional model, so Betsy's one of our regional leaders. But the charge is to make sure that we meet 8 elements of an effective compliance program, that all of the tools and resources that we've put out there are implemented. We spent a lot of time on data analytics and monitoring. We've implemented some tools on the inpatient side. On the outpatient side, we're using a tool for PricewaterhouseCoopers called SMART that enables us to pull data and look at coding and billing. We've also got data analytics working through the business intelligence teams that allow us to look at physicians, look at providers, and see if they're outside the bell curve. And those data analytics really have enabled us to do the work like we did in London, where we identified this particular physician. So, one thing I do want to mention is our risk mitigation efforts sometimes result in us identifying problems. And CHI has taken the position in line with our mission and in line with transparency that if we identify a outlier or a physician pattern that is unacceptable, we will look at it, or not acceptable, but not justifiable from general, analytics. We will look at it and determine what's the reason for that outlier. Is it justified? Could it pose a problem? And when we find a problem, we will self-report those. We've been very successful over the years. I've been here 11 years. We've had many negotiations with the government as a result of our self-disclosures and have had very minimal corporate integrity agreement exposure other than at the entity level. I can tell you with each of our investigations, the government always looks at the region. They look at CHI, and they do try to pull them into these investigations and talk about the potential of getting a corporate integrity agreement at the national level. This is one of the reasons why we centralized the function, is we wanted to be able to show that because of our data analytics, because of the strong monitoring processes that we've put in place, the hotline, the various tools and resources that we've put in place, that while we have a strong non-compliance program, and therefore CHI should not get a corporate integrity agreement at the national level. That doesn't say that couldn't happen at some time. I think all of you on the phone understand that the regulatory, investigatory arena is extremely difficult and that the government is recovering tremendous amount of money from these investigations. Most of our compliance matters deal with human error, whether it's, that something was put correctly into a charge master or had employee turnover and there was not complete understanding on a regulation. A lot of our issues deal with, those type of error issues, but we do have exposure from every clinician, from every employee in the event they choose to do something wrong or they choose to not follow quality standards. So we're doing a lot at the national level, at the local level, and at the regional level to help mitigate our exposure around medical necessity, clinical appropriateness. We have very solid physician contracting and review procedures, policy 9 and 10. I'm sure many of you have heard those terms used. We implemented those to where every physician arrangement goes through a very strict review process, including independent review by a board oversight committee, a physician transaction review committee. We did a non-monetary compensation basis to track other payments to physicians that fall outside of contracts. We take a physician to dinner or anything, we're monitoring that to make sure there's a reason and that all within the guidelines that are the parameters that the government has set. Also, we're looking at physician-owned entities and making sure that we are not doing business with those. The government has released and then around that, stating that they're leery of those physician-owned entities, and CHI has taken a position that we are not going to contract with entities. We've also are disclosing payments from business sources and following guidelines around that. So a lot of work has been put in place to help mitigate the exposure across CHI. But I do want all of you to understand that because regulations are so difficult and so numerous, we are going to make mistakes in healthcare, and we are going to have issues. At the end of the day, the most important thing is that we are providing quality services to our patients and, appropriately documenting and billing for those services. But as we make mistakes, we are going to self-report them. We're going to make sure that we build processes and policies, procedures to make sure we mitigate ongoing exposure from those issues. But I cannot tell you that we aren't going to have additional matters come to light. One thing I will mention is of 3 corporate integrity agreements that we have had at CHI since I've been here, 2 of those involved whistleblowers. There is a climate and an environment now where whistleblowers or individuals understand they can recover lots of money from reporting issues. And both in Towson and in London, the whistleblowers received approximately $300,000 for bringing forth these issues. So is a way for people to make money. We're very cognizant of that, and that's why we have hotlines. We have internal reporting processes. We're constantly talking and engaging employees to make sure that we are responding to their concerns and to physicians' concerns so that they don't feel they need to become a whistleblower. But can't protect ourselves from those individuals that know that this is a get-rich-quick option for them. So fiduciary role, what we're asking for you, from you, is to make sure that you understand the organization's compliance program, that you make sure that it's adequately resourced, that you've got solid people sitting on your committees who spend time understanding what the program entails, assessing the effectiveness of the program, that you're hearing about the hotline calls that are coming in, that you're hearing about investigations, you're looking at the annual risk assessment and the monitoring activities that are taking place and understanding what's going on in your organization. We are encouraging you to ask the CRO, the internal audit and management, if there are any significant compliance risks out there that have been identified within the organization, and what is being put in place to help mitigate the risk that are out there. We're asked to inquire about the status of ongoing open investigations. Anybody who has been involved in one of these investigations with government understands that these take a very long time. We just recently completed a citywide investigation with the government around implantable cardioverter defibrillators, and that took us almost 4 years to resolve with the government. So these take a lot of time, a lot of resources, but also are very, very costly to the organization. The more that we can get ahead of this, spend monitoring, working with management around educating and deciphering the regulations and making sure that the clinicians understand what that means from a quality standpoint, the less risk we have to the organization overall. We also ask you to make sure you've got a strong, well-informed physician transaction review committee. We know that the government continues to scrutinize healthcare physician relationships and make sure that we are not advising our physicians to refer business to us. That is a highly scrutinized area of the government, and one of the reasons why we have invoked such strong policies. And then also to make sure that you've got a direct line of communication with your corporate responsibility officer. You're having discussions with them and that you feel comfortable with them. Anytime you ever have any concerns, I would ask you to reach out directly to me too, because at the end of the day, we are responsible for this program and we want to ensure that you feel comfortable with the program. So with that, let's on for discussion. I want to know if anybody has any questions, if there's anything we haven't answered. For those of you that can stay on, we'll go over time. But before we start, I just want to ask a question, and then I'll ask the operator, or actually the operator, why don't you go ahead and tell people how they can put a question in queue, and then I'll ask a question of Betsy.
Ladies and gentlemen, at this time, if you wish to pose a question or a comment, please press star followed by 1. To pose a question or a comment, please press star followed by 1. Calls will be taken in the order received. We'll pause for a moment to compile a list.
Thank you. And you guys had a lot of conversations with the government through this process. And I was wondering if you could just recap some of the comments that came out around what you guys had put in place to help prevent this from happening going forward, and had actually weighed in probably having a reduced settlement with the government.
Yeah, I think that the biggest factor in the reduced settlement was the fact that we identified this issue ourselves and made the self-disclosure, and that just shows how CHI and how St. Joseph London, the integrity of the organization, that we want to do the right thing, that we want to resolve these types of issues. They also were very impressed with the review processes that we put in place. We were sending records from every surgeon on the cardiovascular service line to be reviewed every quarter, looking to see if any cases were falling out. And they said that nobody else was doing that anywhere they had been. So the IRO, for example, is now saying that the cath lab there at St. Joseph London is one of the best, one of the tightest run cath labs that they've seen. He did put in place, a lot of preventive measures going forward that I do believe helped mitigate this because the settlement could have been much, much greater.
Yeah, I also think, too, at the end of the day, we had to put all of our compliance program materials together and send them to the government to review prior to negotiating the settlement. And I do think the fact that CHI has invested and put so much time into the development of this compliance program also weighed into the fact that we didn't get a national corporate integrity agreement, a regional corporate integrity agreement in Kentucky 1, or a more stringent corporate integrity agreement in London. Wouldn't you say, Betsy?
Absolutely.
Okay. Let me ask, Are there any questions, anything we can answer for anybody out there?
We have no time. As a reminder, ladies and gentlemen, that's star one to pose your question or your comment.
Well, we appreciate everybody's time. If anybody has any follow-up questions after this webcast, please feel free to email me at michellcooper@catholichealth.net, and that's 2 L's in my name. We're happy to respond to any questions anybody might have. And I just want to thank you all for continuing to support your compliance program and your core responsibility officers. I know they truly appreciate it. So thanks so much for your time today.
Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes today's conference. Thank you so much for your participation. You may now disconnect. Have a great day.